Hello everyone, and very warm welcome to today's webinar about managing the Swedish work permit process. My name is Gilio, and today we're going to talk about the rules and requirements for obtaining a work permit in Sweden, the application process, intra-corporate transfers, and other necessary aspects that you need to keep in mind when you want to bring your staff to Sweden. Before handing over to today's speakers, I would like to start by saying a few words about Business Sweden for those of you who don't know us yet. Business Sweden is a global organization, and we operate with local presence in more than 40 markets in 3 regions, the APAC, Americas, and EMEA. Globally, we are now around 500 employees, and here in Sweden, we operate from our HQ in Stockholm, where we also have close partnership with regional agencies around the country, both to be able to reach out to Swedish companies locally and to facilitate international companies coming to Sweden and the different Swedish regions. For companies looking to establish in Sweden, we can help you to benchmark Sweden as an investment country for finding new opportunities here, and we strive to support investments that have a possibility to create high potential impact. We can help you to shorten the time to market through making your process of entering the Swedish market as smooth and effective as possible. For example, through providing advice, data analytics, and benchmarking, help with site selection, introduction to different stakeholders, and more. And we can also help you to minimize your risk and guide you through the process of investing and establishing here in Sweden. This is, for example, done by guiding you through laws and regulations in Sweden and practical establishment facts, as we will do today. One example is also our establishment guides, and on the topic of establishing a business in Sweden, we offer 16 establishment guides on our homepage, ranging from everything on how to set up a company to taxes, employing staff, and incentives. So if you're considering to invest and establish in Sweden, we can warmly recommend you to read this. With that said, I would like to hand over to Sofia Wennberg and Giuseppe Gilio from Deloitte, who will be the speakers of today's webinar. There is a chat function here in the webinar, and I hope we will have time to address some questions in the end. Otherwise, you can always feel free to email us afterwards if you have any questions about today's topic. And we will also record the webinar and make it available to watch afterwards. So with that said, Sofia and Giuseppe, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, it is for us, and welcome. We will today be discussing Swedish immigration. We'll give a short introduction to Swedish work and residence permits, the process, types of application, and other good to knows. Do you want to start off?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Giuseppe Gilio, and I am a senior manager within Deloitte immigration team. Worked with immigration basically all my career, starting at Deloitte in 2017. Worked with immigration also before that. And yeah, today I'm with my colleague Sofia.
Yep. So my name is Sofia Wennberg. I am a consultant with Deloitte. I graduated with a master in peace and conflict. I got kind of sidetracked and ended up at a migration agency where I worked for a year and a half with just work permits. And then in January 2021, I started with Deloitte and been there since. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before starting and going through the agenda, since it's recorded, we have some formalities we need to go through.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to mention that the information that we will go through today, as well as the information in the presentation, is general information only. Deloitte are not with this information rendering any professional advice or services. Before making any decision or taking any action that may affect your business, you should officially consult an advisor. Due to the nature of the subject, the information changes quickly based on new legislation, guidelines, or court rulings. No warrant is given as to the accuracy or completeness of the information provided, and Deloitte cannot be liable or responsible for any loss or damage arising directly or indirectly in relation to any person relying on the information.
Yep. And with that said, the agenda for today is we're going to provide you with a short introduction of Deloitte, so you understand why we are fit to be standing here today and telling you about all this. We're going to touch about company establishment and then go through type of applicants, permits, and the application process. We will look at and talk about work permit exemptions and how they should be applied, as well as employer responsibilities before we round up with upcoming changes, allow the time for questions, and then have some closing remarks. So Deloitte is a global auditing firm first and foremost. We have above 2,000 strong immigration professional force as well. We are present in 135 countries and have over 40 years of experience with immigration and global employment services. We are present in most regions, also the US, with a workforce of about over 1,000 immigration professionals. However, they fly under another color, as US regulations that do not allow us to, an auditing firm, to work with immigration. So it's Barry Appleman and Leiden who provide services there. In the EMEA region, we are about 400 people working with immigration, and our immigration hub is central in the UK, where we manage most of our global major engagements. And in Sweden, we have been working with immigration since 2011. We are today one of the market leading service providers, and we have our backbone in compliance work, where we focus on complete and correct applications for most work permits, but also other types of permits. We have advisory services that focuses on more complex cases and legal issues or questions that might arise. We do also assist with services such as appeals. The team itself, it's 25. We are about 25 team members, and we're growing. We come with backgrounds from law, economics, and social science. We have experience from mobility work, the migration agency, the migration court, other Swedish authorities, as well as Swedish and foreign embassies and relocation companies. So we have a lot of wide array of knowledge and experience in the team. Moving on.
Yes, so we're moving now to the first part of this presentation, is about the establishment of a company and how this is connected with the immigration requirements in Sweden. We have divided and simplified the kind of companies that you might have established or you would need to establish in order to obtain a permit in Sweden into. Basically, you can either need to employ personnel locally or have the personnel working within an intra-corporate transfer setup, meaning that personnel would be assigned working from a company abroad to another company within the same company group, which is in Sweden. Or eventually, and that would be the third case that it's on the right of this slide, in case you would need to send personnel working directly to a client without any direct connection with any company established in Sweden, which is part of the same company group of the employer. And this is a very important part, because in order to obtain a work permit in Sweden, you always need to have an entity, an host company, which can be part of the same company group, as we mentioned, or not, but this is always necessary. And what is important to mention is that, of course, registrations for a company in Sweden are important, and of course it depends also on the kind of setup that you have at hand. If you have a person that needs to be has to be employed locally, then of course all the registration must be in place for the company in Sweden. Usually these are the F-tax employer, of course, and for VAT purposes. And but this is also something that can help in case you have personnel that is working within the same company group and is working for a newly established or a company that is part of the same group that is in Sweden, because especially if the company is newly established, being fully registered is something that can help. It can help obtaining a work permit. And it is fundamental in case the company wishes to be certified at the migration agency as a certified actor, meaning that they would have access to a Fasttrack. Fasttrack that you can also have access through eventually an agent, as Deloitte is, as Sofia mentioned. When it comes to the form of the company, this is not fundamental, but you can either have an AB, so an aktiebolag, or a branch of this company in Sweden. And of course, you have to consider that in case of local employment, all the conditions must be guaranteed by the company in Sweden, while this is not a fundamental requirement in case of a person that is working within the same company group assigned to Sweden. When it comes to the other option, this is usually the one that is mostly applicable in case the sending entity does not have an entity in Sweden which is part of the same group, or in case they wish to send personnel directly working at their client site. When this happens, this means that all the information that will need to be indicated when submitting an application for a work permit in the document called offer of employment, my colleague Sofia will go through that in a short while, will need to be from the receiving entity, meaning that this would be the client of a company which is established abroad, so outside of Sweden. This can be a bit confusing because, of course, the conditions offered are not guaranteed directly by a client in Sweden, but it's fundamental for the migration agency who needs to have a company in Sweden to have a dialogue with eventually. So even if the conditions offered are not directly guaranteed by the client in Sweden, this client still needs to be the one indicated on the offer of employment, along with all the other conditions that are offered to the employee assigned working in Sweden. This is, of course, valid only in case of an assignment and not in case of a local employment where this kind of setup is not possible. With this, I think we can move forward to the next part.
Yes. So after establishing a company or a connection to the Swedish market, we have to discuss the permits and the type of applicants, permits and application processes that you will face when hiring someone to go into Sweden or locally in Sweden. We want to start off by touching on EU national and the free movement that they have between member states. An EU national has the right to live, work and study in Sweden for up to 3 months without any formalities being taken. You can also start your own business, but after 3 months you need to kind of validate your right to reside in Sweden by registering with the tax agency. And to do this, you need an employment, you need to be self-employed, you need to show proof of study or that you are self-sufficient. You also need to have a valid ID that is issued by one of the EU member states. If a EU national brings along family members that are non-EU national, as what we call a third country national, they need to apply for a so-called residence card, a uppehållskort, as we say in Swedish. And to do this, the EU citizen in question, meaning the applicant, maybe your employee, they need to demonstrate that they do have the right to reside in Sweden by going to the tax agency together with their family members. Depending on the nationality of the family member, an entry visa may be required, and this is something that is applied for via the local embassy in the home country or the country of residence. So having right of residence means that you do not really need to renew anything, but after 5 years, you can be granted permanent residence right, and a family member who holds a residence card can be granted permanent status of that card. It also allows for the ability to apply for Swedish citizenship after 5 years if you qualify, but that's a different discussion that we'll not be going in today. For Nordics, there are some special cases for EU nationals as well, or more local to Sweden. For example, Nordic citizens, there are two sets of rules that apply, as some of them are also EU national, but there are also Nordic regulations allowing for a quicker and better communication within the Nordics that can be applied. Citizens of Switzerland must apply for a residence permit if they wish to stay longer than 3 months. This can, however, be applied for from within Sweden and approved while they are here. Otherwise, the main rule states that a permit needs to be granted before entry. We also have a third category of individuals, and that is those who have permanent residence status in another EU state. In Sweden, this is called varaktigt bosatt. This status can allow for some rights that are close to the ones that the EU and EEA nationals hold, whilst not the same. It is also possible to move the status to another country. It's not very common, but it can be done. Then we have the main category of individuals that apply for work permit, work and residence permits, and that's the third country national. By definition, this is someone who comes from outside and holds a citizenship and a passport from a country outside the EU and EEA. And for them to be able to live and work here, they need to apply for either a residence permit or a work permit. A residence permit gives you the right to reside in Sweden for more than 3 months. And a work permit gives you the right to work in Sweden. What is usually applied for is a combined residence and work permit. And this will grant you then the right to do both. On the screen, there is a little table showing that what you need to apply for in certain cases. And as you see, we make a difference between for how long people should be here and if they are visa exempt or not. When one has been granted a work permit, there are some things to keep in mind. And the main thing is that a Swedish work permit is limited for the first 24 months to the occupation and the employer as stated by the decision letter, which most usually is what you applied for. And after month 25 and onwards, a work permit is tied to the occupation stated in the decision letter. In practice, this means that any changes to the employee's title, role, or tasks might result in a new application being needed. It also means that any organizational changes resulting in an employee working for a new employer, for example, the change from an organizational number, might require a new application and a permit to be granted. More often than not, this can be done and the employee can continue working whilst it's being processed, but it's important to keep it in mind and that it is done before the changes take place. So we have talked a little bit about different types of setups, and with that we also have different types of hiring and different requirements. Speaking about local hires, when the employee holds a local contract in a Swedish company, the first thing to keep in mind and that needs to be fulfilled as a requirement is that the position has been advertised correctly. Advertised correctly means that the role that the employee is commencing has been advertised for at least 10 days within the EU and EEA. This requirement is a little bit special, but it's also very necessary that it's completed correctly, because if you have not advertised correctly, this is a ground for rejection, and it's a very, very easy rejection for the migration agency to make. The recommendation is to always advertise via Platsbanken, or because then it reaches the European-wide EURES, which is a platform for employment advertisement. And this is done to actually fulfill the requirement. We know that a lot of companies, and especially global companies, usually advertise on their own web page or via LinkedIn. but there has been so many instances where this has been assessed and as not fulfilling the advertisement requirement. It's very rare that you can get an application through by saying, oh, we advertised on our own global page, sadly. So the recommendation is to look at Platsbanken and the opportunities that they offer to advertise. The second, the second requirement is that there needs to be a contract. This contract needs to be signed by both the employee and the employer, and it needs to contain the terms of employment that will be in effect when the employee is working here. Good things to think about when looking at the contracts is there a probationary period and how will it affect a permit when it's signed, and if there needs to be an amendment made to it to fit the requirements as per the migration agency standard. Do we want to talk about probationary periods?
Yeah.
Since we had a few law changes a while back, when we actually needed to start submitting the contracts to the migration agency, there was not a requirement before. Probationary periods have become a little bit of an issue because the migration agency is viewing the probationary periods as being the only amount of guaranteed employment that the employee has, which usually results in the applicant only getting a 6 months period if that's the probationary period. And this can be problematic from 2 points of view, usually because due to long processing times, the probationary period that they are accounting for maybe has already started. So the employee is getting a very, very short permit that's less than 6 months. And the issue with this is that when extending a permit that is shorter than 6 months, if you hold a permit that is shorter than 6 months, you are not allowed to work during the processing of that extension. So it's always good to consider if the probationary period is needed, or at least how you formulate it in the contract, that it's open-ended and dependent on the immigration process rather than between this date and that date. Otherwise, you might face some issues with that. We also know it's an issue from an individual aspect, as if you're getting a 6 months permit, you will not qualify for registering with the Swedish population register and get a social security number in Sweden, which might create issues with banking and everything else digital in this country technically. So that's good to keep in mind. Regarding the employment terms, there are some requirements that the migration agency puts, and that is that it should be on the same standard or as par with collective agreements or what's customary within the occupation or industry. Then they also want to know the salary and the insurance coverage, and they will be looking at this when extending a permit. So it's good that it's there and it's good that it's up to standard. And regarding the salary, the migration aid, there was recently a rule change that increased the salary benchmark. So the minimum gross salary today needs to be 26,560 Swedish kroners. This is a benchmark, or the benchmark should at least be 80% of the median salary in Sweden as per SCB. What do you
Statistics.
say? Yeah, the Bureau of Statistics in Sweden. To meet this maintenance requirement and salary threshold to be able to be granted a permit. As a part of the process, you will be collecting a trade union opinion, and this is a mandatory step, and it should be sent to the central organization. So not the local club or anything else, it should be sent to the central trade union. This can be done via the migration agency e-system, and it's very, very convenient if you do it that way. But it's a mandatory part. It takes about 10 days to get this statement, and this needs to be accounted for in the timeline of processing a permit. Last but not least, it's important to know that individual applying needs to be outside Sweden during the time that the migration agency is processing and making a decision in their case. And this is the main rule, and it's applicable on about all first-time type of applications. And if the individual has been to Sweden recently, they need to show proof of exit. And for any reason, if the person needs to travel to Sweden, the migration agency should be informed, and they should provide proof of exit upon exit. When it comes to assignments or secondments, the same requirements as we have gone through now applies, except there is no advertisement requirement, as the employee in this case usually keeps their employment at home and they're only assigned to go to Sweden. So there's no new role opening up that the EU or Swedes should have access to. Also included in the application needs to be an assignment letter or a secondment contract stipulating the terms of employment when the person are in Sweden. Lastly, a PVD registration should be done. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, absolutely. So when assigning personnel to Sweden, then the PWD registration rules would apply, meaning that personnel needs to be registered. And in Sweden, the agency responsible for this is the Arbetsmiljöverket. The registration needs to be done regardless the citizenship of the applicant. So this is not only applicable for third country nationals, this is also applicable, it's good to know, for Swedes that are working in Sweden as on an assignment, or EU citizens. But of course it's fundamental when it comes to third country national. This is not a direct requirement from the migration agency perspective, but it's very good to know because another agency is responsible for checking and controlling this. A PWD registration is required from the very first day, the latest. So it's important to register the person immediately when this is confirmed being sent on an assignment, or lastly, the very first day of working, to avoid fines or other issues, I would say.
And any changes made before the start date or before the end date should also be reported to Arbetsmiljöverket accordingly. With that said, we also just want to touch upon the insurances, because we know there's been a lot of questions and sometimes a little bit unclear about this. There are four mandatory insurances that you need to have in place to be granted a work and residence permit in Sweden. It's health insurance, life insurance, occupational injury insurance, and occupational pension insurance. Health insurance in this case concern loss of income and not health care coverage. The Swedish social security system does not equal to this, and that's good to keep in mind as well. If it's a local employment, these insurances should be covered by a local provider. However, if it's an assignment or a secondment, these can be international or foreign in the home country, but they need to be at par with the Swedish standards and according to collective agreements or customary within the occupation or industry. And then just a short repeat of what we mentioned earlier. You need 3 months at least to be granted a residence permit. If you do not have 3 months, then maybe a visa, or you can use your Schengen days instead. If you go more than 3 months, then you will get a work permit and a residence permit. There's a 6 months permit period minimum to apply for a work permit extension and be able to work in Sweden while the extension is being processed. If you have less than 6 months, then you need to wait until a decision is made. And then again, you need a 1-year permit at the moment you are visiting the Swedish tax agency in order for the individual to register and receive a personal identification number in Sweden. When it then comes to extending these permits, the applicant can stay and continue working in Sweden as long as the application is submitted before the previous permit expires. And this means that it needs to have reached and been registered with the Swedish Migration Agency before the permit that they hold today expires. If you, for example, for any reason would be sending anything by post, then the time for postage needs to be considered. And also if you email for some reason an application, it needs to be sent and registered within the time frame. If you use their e-system, the registration will be direct, and that's you get the control number and everything straight away to be able to track. When applying for an extension, it needs to be demonstrated that the conditions that were offered in the first application has been met during the period that the applicant has been in Sweden. This means that the migration agency will be looking at the offered terms of employment, such as salary, title, tasks, insurances, how much they should be working, what type of, and so on. And then when assessing the extension, they will be reviewing that everything has been as said. So you will have to provide signed insurances, you will have to provide pay slips, income statements, and a little bit of everything to show this. You usually extend for a first-time permit is usually granted for 2 years if there's no probationary period or anything else such as a short passport limiting the permit. And then when extending, you are usually granted a 24 months more, meaning 2 years. And then when you reach 48 months of holding a Swedish work and residence permit, you qualify for permanent residence permit. This process is, in practice, it's very close to an extension application, but it's more document heavy and it has a few other requirements. It's up to the migration agency to make the assessment when applying if you are eligible for a PR, and what they are looking at is that the terms of employment has been met. You need to be able to be granted an extension before you can even apply for a permanent residence. Adding on, they will look at utilization of previous permits, that you have actually utilized your permits for a certain amount of time, and that you have housing and your housing costs in relation to the standard amount, and then that you are able to financially support yourself. So they are looking at your current employment. There are a little bit more details, but I don't think it's going to be helpful to go into them today. But then you also have the option, if the applicant does not plan to settle here in Sweden permanently, or if they for some reason are not eligible for permanent residence, that they can obtain a new temporary one instead. So they just extend it as any regular extension process. The same goes for dependent family members that have been along on this journey, and it's good to know that if they also have different requirements when they reach the stadium of PR, meaning they will also be looking at utilization of the dependent family members permits. They will be looking at the housing situation for the family and that it's of the right size and standard, and what type of contract they hold, or if they bought their apartment and so on. And then all applicants above the age of 18 will need to be able to financially support themselves. And this has created some issues, but also there is the opportunity also for the dependent family members to continue on the temporary permit track. However, if the main applicant, the employee in this case, would be granted a permanent residence, it's super important that the housing requirement is met for them to be able to be granted a new temporary one. If it's not, they risk rejection and will have to leave the country upon receiving a rejection. Yep. We have included a short roadmap or process overview for the Swedish residence permit, work and residence permit process. Just to kind of visualize the journey a company and an applicant goes through on their way to retrieving and securing a permit, starting off with advertisement and candidate selection. And this serves as a reminder that an advertisement needs to be made for at least 10 days within the EU EEA before it can be offered to a third country national. No documentation should be signed before this advertisement has been completed, because it can, for example, premature signing of an offer letter or a contract can disqualify the advertisement. Once advertisement is completed, you are free to start the application process. The applications process is divided into 3 parts. You draft an offer of employment. This is step 1 in the application system, which contains all the information and about employment and offer terms of employment. So this is technically the employer's part of the application. Once completed, this is sent off to the trade union for review. They have 10 days to give their opinion and send it back to you before you can continue with the application. If it goes more than 10 days, you are free to continue the application, but you will have to tell the migration agency why a trade union statement have not been obtained or submitted with the application. Upon receipt of the trade union opinion, you finalize part 3 of the application, which is called the application. And this is the employee's part of the application, which covers their personal information, their educational history, their work history, their family members, where they live, and passports and everything like that. And once everything is completed, you submit the application to the migration agency, you receive a tracking number for tracking purposes, and then you wait. The submitting a complete and correct applications is super important for easing the processing and speeding up the processing. So making sure that all parts is where they should and that information is correct do help in the processing. It also, of course, lessens the risk for rejection. But also good to know that upon submission, there is one more step that needs to be completed, and this is passport control and/or biometrics. Upon request from the migration agency, the applicant and any accompanying dependents needs to visit a Swedish mission abroad to show their passport in person. Depending on their visa requirements, it might be suitable to give biometrics at the same time for the later on to be produced residence permit card. But this depends on the situation and should be, and usually the embassies are quite helpful in deciding on how it should be processed. Once this is done, and if the migration agency has no questions, a permit is approved. And upon approval, the applicant is free to relocate to Sweden. The applicant will be compliant from the first date, a valid date of the permit, meaning if they have a date in the future, because of a start date maybe, they will not be work compliant until that date of the permit. If the requested start date for any reason has passed or the migration agency have made a decision from the date of decision, they become work compliant straight away. And then depending on visa requirements and if they have been able to submit biometrics or not, they might need to respect some visa requirements before relocating as well. Upon relocation, it's important to track expiry to remain work so that the employee remains work compliant and that an application for extension is submitted before expiry. So that's a quick overview on what the permit process is like.
Yes, and now we are gonna talk a bit about the ICT permit, which can be a bit confusing because an ICT permit is an intra-corporate transfer permit, as the one that Sofia was also mentioning before. But when we talk about the ICT permit, we are talking about a permit which is the result of ICT directive coming from a European Union. And as such, it has like a different set of rules. The first one I would like to mention is the fact that being an EU kind of permit, this is superior to national permits, if we want to call them like that. Meaning that if a candidate is actually fulfilling the requirement for an ICT permit, then this kind of permit must be applied for. There's no possibility to apply for a national permit. So first of all, an intra-company transfer permit is a kind of permit that is applicable only for assigned personnel. So it's not for local contracts or locally employed personnel. The same is applicable or not applicable for a personnel that is currently living, so is resident within the European Union. And this kind of permit or directive has been implemented within the whole European countries, apart from two, which are Ireland and Denmark. So for all the others, the same or more or less the same set of rules would apply. An intra-corporate transfer permit is applicable only for three kinds of personnel. The first one is executives or specialists or trainees. So if someone is an executive or in a specialist position, a specialist role, or is a trainee and is living outside of European Union currently and is to be sent to work in Sweden for in Sweden or in any other EU country which is implemented rule for an assignment, they would need to apply for an ICT permit. The the reason why we have an ICT permit is that this is increasing the mobility for personnel. So basically, if you have the need of someone in this position to work in different EU countries, applying and obtaining an ICT permit in one of the EU countries allows this person to basically move to other countries within the European Union, excluding the 2 countries we mentioned before, without the need to apply for a national permit in each separate country, but basically continue working in each country without any further formality, or not that many formalities. What is important is that if you have a person that has been granted an ICT permit in another EU country that needs to work in Sweden, this person can do that within for a period of 90 days within one of the 80 days period. Or if they need to stay longer, they can apply for an ICT for longer staying, or eventually to apply for a Swedish ICT permit if their staying in Sweden would be the main country, or if Sweden would be the main country where they need to perform their duties. There's also here a requirement for the PWD registration, because again, this is for all personnel that is working on assignment in Sweden. And good to know also is that this permit is also granting the right for family members to move to Sweden and to live and work as well. I mean, at the same way as this applies for national permits, as that we mentioned before. What is important to mention, however, is that there are some differences. The first of all, regarding family members, is that, and we will see this in the next slide, is the fact that family members here are only, when it comes to children, are only considered as such until the age of 18. While it is 21 when we're talking about the national work permits. But also when it comes to the processing time, at the migration agency, ICT permits are not processed by the same department, if you want to say, but a specific one. The processing time has to be by law max 90 days. And when it comes to the length of the permit, the difference between this and the national permit is that it can be granted for a maximum period of 3 years, meaning 2 years plus max 1 for managers and specialists, and for interns is only 1 year. There is no way to further extend an ICT permit beyond this threshold. The only way to keep working with the same kind of occupation, so as a specialist or an executive in Sweden after the 3 years would be, or within the European Union, this is the 3 years threshold for all the countries, is to leave Sweden in this case, and then apply again for a new permit. This can be an issue if you have someone on an assignment in Sweden that has to last longer than 3 years and is fulfilling the requirement for ICT, but there's at the moment no way to avoid this apart from eventually granting or offering this person local employment and trying to make a change while being in the country. There's no cooling off period in Sweden, meaning that, and this is the difference between the different countries, so in each country has different requirements. Meaning that this person can just leave the country and then apply immediately again for an ICT permit again and have this granted. But of course, the processing time again would be up to 90 days. So there is a disruption in the time that this person has to spend and work in Sweden in order to keep doing this after 3 years. Another difference is regarding the insurances. There are still all the other requirements to be fulfilled when it comes to salary levels and insurances, as I mentioned, and so on. But for ICT permits, it's necessary also to submit, along with the application, a fifth kind of insurance certificate, or like as insurance certificate, which is for health care insurance. As Sofia mentioned before, when we talk about health insurance, we do not mean health care insurance for Swedish rules, but a loss of income kind of insurance. In this case, you also need an insurance covering you for all the medical needs that you would need in Sweden. This insurance must be valid for the whole period of assignment in Sweden if this is shorter than a year, or for at least 3 months if this assignment in Sweden is for longer than this. And this is basically only connected to the right for the person to be income price in the Swedish social security system when they have a 1 year or more longer permit, which would cover also for medical costs, of course, coverage. As I mentioned, there are different rules that are applicable in countries, especially when it comes to the eligibility for this person, for the personnel to be moving to Sweden. One of the main one is how long this person has to be working in the country abroad, so outside of the European Union, before being assigned to Sweden in order to be eligible for ICT. In Sweden, it's 3 months, but other countries might have 12 months for specialists or executives. For this reason, there is like a specific study that Deloitte has published a year and then updated this after the ICT directive was implemented. This will be available. If you need this, you can contact us or Business Sweden to have a copy of it. It's available online. And as was mentioned before, also there are some specific rules or important information regarding family members and other type of permits. For family members, as I mentioned, all family members up until when it comes to children until the age of 21 can be considered as co-applicants, so they can follow their parents to Sweden. However, 18 is the threshold when it comes to other kind of permits like ICT or a EU Blue Card. When it comes to partners, these are considered as co-applicants or wife or husband, cohabiting partners or registered partner to the main applicant before moving to Sweden. Only in some specific situations as children above the age of 21 can be granted a permit as co-applicant, but otherwise they won't be able to follow as co-applicant. They will need to have their own ground in order to be granted a permit in Sweden. There are different processing time, of course, if they apply together with the main applicant or separately. We're not going to touch this, but it's good to know. Other kind of type of permits, of course, that are not work permits related or not direct work permits related are job seeking visas, which is a very new visa, which is available for personnel who wants to, not personnel, people who wants to move to Sweden and search for a job. And if they find one, they can apply for a work permit while being in the country. This is a very new kind of permit. Students, of course, a student permit, who also has the right to work in Sweden during the period they have a student permit. Previous students that have completed the studies that are searching for a job, asylum, of course, seekers, and long-term residents. So what Sofia was mentioning in the beginning, people that have been living in another EU country for at least 5 years and have obtained this specific status, or EU Blue Card, which is basically correspective of the ICT, but for local hires. So people that are working locally in a EU country. Finally, I just want to mention very quickly regarding the exemption from work permit. The question is, do you really always need a work permit to work in Sweden? And the answer, of course, is no. There are some situations where you don't need this. The list is very long. We're not going through all of it. This is only a couple of the ones that we believe are the most important ones, are the most utilized one, I would say. But what is important to mention is that you can find them, first of all, on the Migration Agency website. But what is very important to mention here is that before applying, assessing if a person is actually exempted from work permit, you really need to consider all the factors that are indicated in the law and, of course, in the list on the Migration Agency, because there's no way for the Migration Agency to make this assessment for the applicant in advance. If you apply for a work permit, they will always grant one, even if you would eventually be exempted in most of the cases. Working, of course, without a work permit in Sweden is illegal, so that's why you need to consider this very carefully.
Yes, and moving on to the employer responsibilities, we have a slide here that is quite extensive. It's saved to be here as a reference if you need it, but we'll go through it quite quickly. Your responsibilities and good to knows is that before offering an individual who already is in Sweden employment to check what their permit allows them to do, what nationality they have, and if they need what type of permit they need. And it's good to know that by law, it's you, the employers, who are responsible to make sure that your employees hold the right permit to work in Sweden. If you are not compliant with this, it might result in penalties such as fines or, in worst case scenarios, imprisonment. Then again, if at local employment, remember to advertise. This is such an easy step to do. It's also something that creates a lot of problem. It's not done correctly. Do not sign anything before the advertisement is completed. consider if the probationary period is actually needed, and make sure that the employment terms offered are in a level with collective bargaining agreements in Sweden or what's customary within the occupation and industry. Then also save copies of documentations for the individual's right to reside or work in Sweden during their entire employment, and then also up to 12 months after the employment has ended. And this is just to be able to prove that you're being compliant. There is also a requirement, it's not applicable to everyone, and the migration agency will let you know if this applies to you, to report any negative changes made to the employment and employment terms while an applicant holds the permit with you. Common mistakes, as mentioned, not advertisements or incorrect advertisement, offering a position too early, missing insurances, not checking the permit, as Giuseppe mentioned, sending people on business trips when they maybe should have had a work permit, and then not checking the salary levels regularly. And then again, we also want to make sure that you know to notify the tax agency when needed, which is basically any time a third country national is employed locally, no matter what type of permit they have, and this should be done no later than the 12th month after the employee has started, and you find the forms needed for this at the tax agency, and it's also noted what it's called on the slide.
Yeah, so just to wrap this up, you have basically to consider 3 steps. The first one is the establishment of a local entity, if this is not already present, and the advertisement, if this is needed, if we're not talking about like an assignment in Sweden, and an application, and then the relocation, of course, for the personnel, if the person is not exceptionally exempted by any requirement for a work permit. When it comes to when it comes to the last part of our presentation, we want to mention like a very big change that is happening. This has been confirmed on the 12th of May, so just a couple of weeks ago, which basically informed when basically it was confirmed that the certification, so the Fasttrack system, will be dismantled, as we know this today. As you may know, today it's possible to be a registered company, certified company, the migration agency, or certified agent, the migration agency, such as Deloitte is, in order to have fast-track applications granted within a very short processing time. It should be between 10 and 20 business days, depending on the application we're processing. However, this won't be the case any longer. We don't know yet when this will happen. We will have more information probably starting from September 2023. What we know today is, however, that the current system will basically be substituted by a new system, which will be based basically on a priority list. So depending on the requirements, if the requirements are fulfilled or what are the conditions, then the processing time might be shorter or a bit longer. What we know today is that highly skilled workers, based on the SSY code, so basically the employment that you are offering, will be granted a fast track, if you want to call it that, of 30 business days. Provided the applications are complete and correct, which is very important to avoid delays. On the second priority list is occupation with specific regulations, and these, like all the other occupations we mentioned before, and the kind of permits that we mentioned before, so ICT, of course, and EU blue card and so on, but also artists, berry pickers, most probably, and au pairs, etc. There is then the non-qualified occupations, which is applicable to all the kind of occupations where academic skills are not required. And then all the other industries where there is like a requirement for extra investigations, and these are usually the industries that are more subject to exploitation of the rules, of course, of employment in Sweden, and this could be cleaning, hotel, restaurant, construction, automotive repair industry, and so on. We don't know a lot yet about how this will be implemented. What we know today is that it's still possible to apply and to be a certified employer until the 1st of June 2023. After this deadline, it's not possible to apply any longer. For agents, it's still possible to register other companies under their fast track until we be informed otherwise. Going to the very last slide of our presentation, we have also there's some possible future changes. These are like mostly rumors, I would say, or like discussions that have been like up in the air quite a long time. But we expect this four maybe to be the most important one. Most probably it will be implemented an healthcare insurance requirement also for work permits valid up to 1 year. Same as applies to ICT permits, as we mentioned before. Some occupations could be totally excluded from the right to apply for a work permit in Sweden. We don't know yet which ones will be. There is also will be most probably modify the possibility to do a so-called status change, so basically moving from one permit to another permit while being in Sweden. And the very last one is that most probably, but this has been discussed quite long and not implemented yet, there will be a language or additional knowledge requirement in order to apply and obtain a permanent residence permit.
Yep.
And this was our last slide. I don't know if you have questions or.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe and Sofia, for this very informative and good presentation. So we have about 5 minutes left, I can see. So let's check if there are any questions that we have gotten. So maybe we have time for one or two. There we have one here. Under secondment, is it meant for work-related activities or can it also be meant for business-related activities? Having said this, which visa will be applicable? Is work or business?
Well, I mean, the difference is basically, the difference would be based on the kind of activities that will be performed in Sweden. If the person is going to be working in Sweden, so performing actual work, then a work permit is required. It doesn't matter how long this is happening in Sweden. You can also obtain a work permit in theory for a couple of days. But if the activities that will be performed are not to be considered work, like business meetings or like attending trainings or meetings of any sort, then most probably an application won't be required. Then the rules that are applicable in your European Union of 90 days within a 180 days period would apply. Or of course, like other exemptions that might be applicable. As I mentioned before, there's a very big list of exemptions that could be reviewed. But I would say that the main difference is depending on the activities that will be performed. If it's actual work, then a work permit is applicable.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very interesting. And we have got one question here about the ICT permit. What classifies as a specialist? Could a senior project manager working at a construction site be a specialist?
Yeah,
for example, quite specific question, but
that's a very good question, and this I can say is one of the questions that you most often receive. So I have here with me also the definition of a specialist. In order to decide what a specialist is, you can refer to the Article 3F of the ICT Directive. I could read this very quickly, but maybe the very first part is important and is mentioning that a specialist means a person working within the group of undertakings, possessing specialized knowledge essential to the host entity's areas of activity, techniques, and management. In assessing such knowledge, account shall be taken not only of knowledge specific to the host entity, but also of whether the person has a high level of qualification, including adequate professional experience, referring to a type of work or activity requiring specific technical knowledge, including possible membership of an accredited profession. So it's quite wide, but I recommend to have a look at this. It's Article 3F of the ICT Directive, if you prefer. The easiest way would be, of course, for the occupations that are regulated. So if you have a doctor, for example, then you need also to provide a license showing that you are a doctor. This is, of course, considered as a specialist. But otherwise, how important this person is for the business effort, that specific kind of assignment of work in Sweden is the way to look at.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question about timing. So if a work permit and residence permit is needed, how long before should you think of applying? How long should you prepare before this?
I would say that the like a very good span would be like 3 or 4 months. So to have time to both collect the information that are required, but also to have a look to possible issues and how to eventually tackle them. Then very much depends on how quickly the documents are ready, available, either provided to an agent or like ready for the submission. If of course we're talking like a very first time work permit application needs to be extended, and this person has only worked for one employer in Sweden, and I don't know, this person most probably was covered by a collective bargaining agreement, so all the conditions were basically confirmed and on par with what is required by the regulations of migration agency, then probably it would not be needed that many months, but as per our experience, 4 months would be a good idea to look at, start looking at extension.
Great.
Yes.
Yes,
Perfect.
and the first time I think you need at least 6 months.
Yeah, definitely. But then you have also, of course, to consider the advertisement requirements, yes, and the contract, how this is outlined in order to fulfill the requirements of migration agents, and so 6 months.
But good to care with that a complete and correct application where you are proactive, it will shorten the processing time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Great. So with that said, thank you very much everyone for listening in. And if you come up with any further questions now after this webinar, feel free to reach out either directly to Deloitte or to us at Business Sweden. And yeah, with that said, thank you very much for coming to us today. And we wish you a pleasant day or evening. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.